don't just want a service or a company that seems interesting. You want a lifestyle, right? Something aspirational to believe in, which represents you as a person and where you're headed with your life. Wrong. That shit makes you a pleb. And you are primed for some bullshit marketing, probably get tricked into joining some sort of religion, maybe even a cult. So if you want to end up, strapped up, hoarding canned food, other cult members around, all waiting for the apocalypse, go ahead. Or, alternatively, I'm not telling you what to do, play fantasy esports and bet with EsportsPools. It's a legit company. It's got somewhat good people. I mean, I don't watch them all day long. I can't really verify what their ethics are and the level of morals at the company, but they seem fine to me, who offer fun services such as fantasy esports. You make a team, pick the players you want, see how they do based on their in-game score. They've got betting, including in-play betting, where you can actually now make bets during games that are live. So, choice is yours ultimately. Now, last year, I made a video which was basically events worked in 2015. And the concept was that year I worked a lot of events. It was the most in my career by far. Like in the past, I'd done I think in 2013 I did 2 events. In 2014 I did something like 7 events. These each included a major each year. In 2015, I had worked at 17 events, including the Cluj-Napoca major, with a whole slew of different companies. It was one of the events I really, really got busy in terms of getting myself out there. Did a lot of deals with a lot of companies to kind of spread my brand out. Really, hopefully perfect and hone some of how I do casting, which is actually something I started to do towards the end of that year in terms of finding my role. And so I remember, I think it was an AMA, maybe halfway through last year, someone asked me something along the lines of, maybe it was earlier this year, would I do another one of those videos? And actually, it's a pretty decent concept, right? So the concept is, I run through the events that I worked at. I give you some of the details of what went on there, perhaps some behind the scenes information, some of the storylines that happened there, remembering them, people I worked with there, some of those elements. So like I said, in 2015, I hit my peak. I worked at 17 events, including a major. Now, funnily enough, in 2016, I worked less events. I worked 15 events, and that included both the majors, MLG Columbus and ESL1 Cologne. But I actually worked, in terms of an event analysis, a lot more days, because obviously 2 of those events were the 2 seasons of E-League, which were a lot of days. I think in total, it was like over 60 days for the 2 seasons, whereas, obviously events in 2015 were like 3 to 4 days. We actually didn't have many of the longer events at that point in time. I worked with some new people I hadn't worked with before. In the past, I'd already worked with the MLGs and Gfinities and StarLadder and PGL because I'd already been out there in the casting world and I'd gotten all the top gigs. This year, I got to work with Turner, so that's in the E-League. I got to work with Counterpit, who actually did their first big CS event in terms of offline. Never worked with them before. And then a lot of the usual suspects, a lot of the StarLadder, Gfinity, PGL, and obviously the big one, the big new one, was I worked with ESL again. So the first event of the year was a one-day event. In fact, it was a one-match event. It was Turner's Road to Vegas tournament, which was for qualifying. Well, technically, it would have been Road to E-League, maybe. I guess Road to Vegas was the qualifier into this. It was a one-day final between the winner of the European qualifier and the winner of the NA qualifier, and the winning team automatically got a spot in the first season of E-League, which actually ended up being quite significant, because if you remember, the teams playing were Lounge Gaming, the Polish guys, Innocent, etc., and Optic, who, listen, this was pre-Tarek, it was back when they still had Shazam, but they were still a decent enough team, and obviously getting into Season 1 was a big deal, especially because it allowed them to continue over into Season 2, and Season 2 is where they, as a team, actually maybe they still had to qualify for that, I think they maybe did, but in Season 2 is obviously where they won the league, so actually getting that kind of foot in the door is significant for where you end up in the qualification system later. It was the first ever day I actually worked with Turner and E-League in any context, because obviously the first season hadn't begun. In fact, at this point in time, we hadn't, I think, even been contracted by Turner. We'd already had discussions to our agents. It was already pretty much decided that which core group of people were going to be working there. So I kind of had it in mind that I was, but I didn't have my visa at this point in time. I hadn't been contracted to actually work for them, but it was pretty much sure that it was going to happen. But as a result, I didn't really know them as a team of people. I didn't know any of the people involved because they're all from outside esports. In fact, most of the crew's made up of people who worked on stuff like inside the NBA, etc., the producer and whatnot. And this was the one where the event was at CES, which is sort of a trade show in Vegas, and The match itself wasn't that great. Lounge actually kind of underwhelmed here. I still think at that point in time they were a better team than Optic, but they didn't do very well in the tournament. Optic narrowly managed to get through the first map as far as I remember. I think it was Train, and then they won the overall series fairly comprehensively when you consider both maps combined. This was the match where the big player was Shazam for Optic, and that obviously leads into my infamous Shaq burn. Now, this was the one where I might make a whole video on this topic because there's a lot I could go into actually, and a lot of interesting elements to it. But the basic storyline is, when we were going to go out and do the post-game show, not even just the post-game for our match, but this show where Inside the NBA was live, and they were going to throw to us partway through their show, and we would sort of tell them about what we'd been doing with video games and E-League at the CES, and that was going to kind of be a teaser for the fact that E-League was coming, and it's on the same network, TNT, or TBS rather, and so it was just kind of a passover to us, and you know, obviously I prepared this joke backstage. I thought to myself, what can I go with here? And then I thought to myself, like, one of the things that's always been kind of an easy way to make fun of Shaq is obviously the movies he was in, which were obviously just like they weren't good movies and he just did them for the paycheck, fair enough, but they were pretty bad. And so I figured out Shazam doesn't sound that dissimilar to Kazam, which was the movie he was in where he was a giant, or he was a genie rather, in the 90s. So I worked that in as my burn. Now, obviously I can go into all the other details in another video, but basically, interestingly enough, here's a little tidbit for you. Shaq is the only person I did not get to meet from that crew, actually. I met Ernie. Ernie Johnson is actually a pretty cool guy. He seems like a very genuine guy. I've met him a whole bunch of times when I've been at Turner, been to his office, etc. He also seems like someone who actually cares about the people he works with. I met Kenny very briefly, and I definitely met Charles Barkley, which for me was actually the main thrill. I don't really care that much about Shaq and the others, but Charles Barkley legitimately is one of my top 2 or 3 all-time favorite basketball players, including from the 90s when I first started to watch somewhat. I always thought he had a fantastic personality, but more importantly, that he was an incredibly dominant player. If you look from 1988 to 1992, this guy was unfucking believable. I could make a case he was actually, in terms of value and effective play, he might have been the most effective offensive player in the NBA, but that's for another video perhaps on my side channel. Now, so it was fun to meet him. He actually is a pretty cool guy as well from the very basic moments I met him. Obviously I can't really know about him, but in terms of his interaction, seemed like a pretty open guy. And interesting enough, we didn't meet Shaq because before the show he wasn't there at that point in time. And then after the joke, here's the thing, even though Shaq, yes, he has to take banter on the show, and there's definitely a lot of jibes back and forth. If you watch Inside the NBA, he was a little bit butthurt about that incident. He didn't want to meet us afterwards, and he didn't really want to shake our hands or any of that. I think he couldn't handle it. He took a little bit of heat from some nerds. So, well, what can I tell you? In our world, that's getting clapped. So overall, it was an alright event. I mean, the game wasn't that great. It was cool to go to Vegas. I've always wanted to go there. I've actually been in the past for esports, but to work an esports event in terms of talent, I've always hoped they'd have more events there. I can certainly understand now, though, why they don't know, because I have to say a lot of pro players are stupid enough to go and lose like 5 figures at the casinos there in the times when they come to visit these events. Now, not this particular one, but in the future, there's a certain event that was in Vegas where players were quite stupid in that sense. So sadly, even though Vegas and Amsterdam are 2 places I think would be very cool in many different regards to have esports, I can understand why events don't host them there, because in Vegas, idiots lose all their money, and then over in Amsterdam, I'm sure a lot of pro players, not a lot, but some pro players, some notable pro players would get high and come to the games and do stupid sort of stuff like that, or potentially get into problems that could reflect upon the event and get the event into trouble with the teams who don't want their players doing these things. So I can actually understand why, sadly, we can't have nice things in that sense. I mean, you can, I would say, just kick out the fucking idiot troublemakers, but unfortunately, a lot of people don't think that way and they want to have more of a compromise. So, less than a week after the event in Vegas, I actually went to Belarus. Yeah, exactly. Like, I remember thinking, like, where the fuck is that? But we went to Minsk in Belarus for the Star Ladder event. It was Star Ladder Season 14, because this is before they partnered with iLeague and rebranded and started from Season 1, Season 2 over again. Like, you might remember the one that FaZe won this year was actually Season 3. But obviously there were Star Ladders before that called Season 3. So anyway, just for this one, it was called Season 14. And the reason it was in Belarus, actually, was due to the war in Ukraine between Ukraine, well, It's like not technically Russia. It's supposed to be like someone within Ukraine's fighting against the Ukrainians or something, some sort of uprising. I don't really know the politics of that shit, but put it this way, it was enough that we couldn't just go to Kiev for the event as usual. I think they were initially thinking of having it in Romania, but they decided against that. So what happened instead was they had it in Belarus, in Minsk, which, I mean, by the way, we're all supposed to pretend that war's still not going on in Ukraine, that it was all resolved, even though it's clearly not the case as far as I can tell. But the news reports what the news reports. Now, interestingly enough, that was actually difficult because everyone who goes to Belarus at that point in time has to have a visa. So we had to apply for our visas. It's actually a little bit more tricky getting in the way you have to do it there. Because we actually did ours like at the airport, which is kind of weird. You have to have the forms prepared and some like documents already done, but then you do it at the airport. So it's very weird in that sense. It's actually the most complicated visa process I've been through, barring getting my work visa for America, but that's a very different setting, obviously. Like getting a visa for China is much easier. You just send off the paperwork or whatever, a week later it comes, you got the visa, you go through the check thing. You know, that's supposed to be a really locked down country, but it's actually not very difficult to get in at all if you've got the proper paperwork. Now, this actual event, while it was literally, we're talking like a foot of snow everywhere, and a lot of the elements of the country weren't that great. Like every time we ordered a pizza, every time, no joke, it would take an hour to an hour and a half for the pizza to come. So there were some elements like that were kind of ridiculous. But with that said, the stadium, while certainly not a modern stadium, was pretty cool overall. Like it seemed like it got a good amount of people in, the location seemed good. The downside was, unfortunately, it was one of those events that had like a curfew. Like I think at 10 p.m. or something, all kids under a certain age had to leave, or maybe all the fans had to leave the stadium. And for some bizarre reason, I don't know why they did this, Starladder kept arranging it so that the big Na'Vi games, because obviously Na'Vi made the final even, were always the second one. Therefore, the curfew would kick out all the fans who wanted to see the best CIS team, which is Na'Vi. And then, so bizarrely, you'd have most of the fans for the game that wasn't the home team, as it were, and then the home team of CIS would not have as many fans there. So I thought that was a bit underwhelming. I don't know why they organised it that way. I think they should have been a bit more cynical in that sense and just gone for the bigger viewing numbers. Although, yes, maybe they wanted the higher viewing numbers on stream. I'm not sure, because obviously that would work better for NA hours. This was the event where Luminosity, now the core that's SK, first really elevated themselves. Like when they had their run at DreamHack, went, okay, that was cool, but most teams didn't really know what to expect from them. It was a brand new lineup, no one even knew if they could play the same way. I also think like FNX massively overperformed at that event and went super ham on clutches in a way that I think is unreasonable to normally expect them to. This was the event where they looked legit, where they looked like a truly world-class team. This is where they beat out Na'Vi in the key games. They practically almost beat Fnatic. Like, they beat Na'Vi for the first time in a best-of-3, which was pretty big. Na'Vi was still a very good team at this point in time. Guardian was godlike. Obviously, at the time, StarX's in-game leading was super sick. The squad looked really strong. And coming into this, the only team that basically could beat them was, you know, prime Dennis-era Fnatic. Now, they beat Na'Vi. They got to the semis, but they lost there to Fnatic in a truly heartbreaking series. Like, this is an example of a game where, I don't often use the term deserved, but if you look at the way the game played out, Fnatic didn't deserve to win this. Luminosity did deserve to win this game. This is the sort of game that, to me, defined that era of Fnatic. It's not that they were dominant in terms of beating each opponent. Yeah, they won all the events. That's dominance in a sense. But in the actual individual games, they weren't dominant. They had to often slip through games, and in scenarios where they'd all but lost the game and they had to use some bullshit individual moments. So the big moment here that I always remember was the Inferno round where Dennis on CT just had a CZ and he killed like 2 or 3 people, one with like a 180 or something inside the A site on Inferno. And that was a massive game changer. I think Luminosity otherwise pretty much closes the game out. At this point, they had kind of integrated some of their old style of playing very smart in numbers advantages, and so Fnatic just did Fnatic things, bullshitted them, got through that. Obviously Fnatic ended up winning the tournament, which is also significant because I actually think also Fnatic was kind of bullshit in the final there, in a sense, which is their level in the final was a lot higher than it had been for the rest of the tournament. But Na'Vi came into the final as a favourite. Like, this is an event where me and Yanko both predicted Na'Vi to win this one. And I remember we've gone over it in tournaments past, where this is one we always point at, where it's basically impossible to correctly predict Fnatic would win for the reasons why they'd win and what would happen in the game and the nature of the game. You look back now, and I think when you look at all the factors, you still have to predict Na'Vi to win that series. Because what happened is in the final, a bunch of the Na'Vi players just fell apart completely. It seems like Fnatic always had a psychological effect upon those guys. And Guardian was still fucking insane. He had that classic highlight on Dust 2 where he like no-scoped a couple of people around the box in the B bomb site. It was insane. And he'd been incredible for the whole tournament. It was probably the MVP of the tournament. But This team just fell apart. And that was the one time where Fnatic looked really strong in a big series. So I think that should have been Na'Vi's title. And they could really have been the best team of those few months. But if you're going to lose to Fnatic and Fnatic's winning all tournaments, you're not going to win these tournaments. Envious at that tournament still had some strength. You know, they were able to beat Fnatic, which they were doing all the time in these tournaments, like they had at EPL. They made a run to the semis, but also, just like those tournaments, they lost to Na'Vi, which seemed to be a time-honored fashion where Na'Vi had started to shift that rivalry to be in their favor. Interestingly enough, Envy were having trouble in those tournaments. They basically lived and died by having strong T-sides. A lot of it was Apex going ham. That's a lot what helped them beat Fnatic. There were certainly issues in the team already, especially with leadership. That was where Maniac was with us on the desk, but he'd already officially joined as coach, but I think he wasn't coaching much at that tournament, and we all know that apparently didn't work out very well as the overall game plan. On the desk, I think he had also done DreamHack Winter the year previously. I actually think Maniac's a decent addition to the desk. He's a good guy. He can take banter. His analysis is decent enough. And the problem is people don't realize this. It doesn't matter who you are as a pro player. It doesn't matter how much in-game knowledge you have as a pro player, or even how much you can talk. It takes quite a while to build up your confidence on a desk, to kind of get where you are within the structure of who's saying what and in what turn, or how to follow on from other people's points. There are a lot of technical skills to learn to be good on desks. That's why I don't think you can just throw people who are ex-pro players on. I think they're going to be as good as Yanko, me, Moses. Sorry, they're not. We've got too much experience on them, and we've actually honed our craft. Some of those guys, they don't even know yet that they have to hone a craft. They think they're just going to turn up and be awesome. There's very few people could do that. So I think he was good, but obviously he needed a few more events to get some more experience under his belt and craft his own kind of niche on the desk. And obviously that never happened because he went off to coach Envious after this. An interesting detail of talent at this event was that we had Sadikist hosting, and this is one of the rare events where he was like the main host. And I actually think he was very good at hosting by the end of the event. It was one of those like 4 or 5 day events, and he started off a bit rusty. He didn't always know how much to talk, how much time to give us, because obviously he's used to being someone who gets like the mic himself and gets to talk a lot. Gradually he pared it down and he got good at setting the questions up. And obviously he's, as you can tell by his casting, he's someone who's really good on his feet. So that's a great quality to have in a host. So you can play back and forwards, and you can have some banter, and you can know when to let people's points run and then when to cut them off. I think by the end he got really good at that, and I really think he could actually have. I know at the time he was thinking about it. Perhaps I pivot, because him and Henry G weren't number one casters yet. Perhaps I pivot and I just become a guy who does the desk instead for DreamHacks and whatnot. And obviously instead they went with Machine. So I think he could have done it. I think, listen, he's the number one caster at the moment in CS, so maybe it wouldn't have been a better career route, but I think it would have been a viable one. I also think it would have been a role that, if he excelled in it, as I think he could have with his skills, that could have also given him a different career route in the future if he doesn't want to do CS anymore. Because there's less of a knowledge burden on the host. It's more about these technical abilities to host and to provoke discussion and to keep people on time and to do all the sponsor aspects and to listen to the producer. So I thought we had some pretty fun moments here. We had some Dota 2 banter, which unfortunately led to some fuckery with like people trying to fuck with me in the industry behind the scenes, actually, that you guys don't know about, who got butthurt that I made jokes about Dota 2 and Alliance. I think I made a joke about Dota 2 players choking or something, because obviously this is like the next big event after the DreamHack Winter with Loda and Richards incident. I also, as a little aside behind the scenes, this is one of the first events where I actually kind of got to vaguely properly meet some of the Dota people. Like I already knew some of the people like LD and Capitalist, etc. But I got to actually meet like some of the EG players. And I think some of them probably watch CS, because I actually think Dota and CS are the two games, not just because they're made by Valve, have the most crossover, because they're both hardcore games within their genre, and they both are games that the core of them has existed for many years. And a lot of people actually started playing Dota because they were pros in other games like Warcraft 3, CS, Quake, and they played Dota for fun on the side with their friends. So I think it's always had an undercurrent, and obviously CS is the most easy game to watch, and everyone's played CS when they were 12. So the crossover between the two games is pretty good, actually. And this is the event, by the way, where Alliance won the event and shockingly beat EG in the final. And it was kind of the little spur revival of Alliance at the time. And I did make a joke with some of the EG players when I was talking to them, that like obviously Richard, by choking Loda, which he didn't really choke him in the sense that people think he did, but that choking him actually choked the choke out of him, and that when he ascended for a moment in heaven, they explained to him how to no longer choke, because Loda actually, in some of these tournaments, him and Alliance hadn't been that good, and then suddenly they couldn't choke anymore, therefore they just ran over the tournament. And I have to say, the EG players didn't seem to appreciate the joke. They obviously didn't know me that well, they knew me a bit from the desks, etc. And I have to say, since then, some of them I've had a good relationship with, love PPD. I mean, obviously, people are going to think he fits in the criteria, the sort of players I like, right? Very successful, very driven, got his own style and way of philosophy on playing the game, but considered a little bit toxic or a little bit of an asshole or a little bit too ruthless. So yeah, right up my alley. I think he's a brilliant guy. He's also, by the way, a fascinating guy in terms of he's one of the only people I know who is an ex-pro who, from while he's still being a pro, when he did all those videos, can do fantastic breakdowns and content, and I think could do even a lot more. As one of the best YouTube channels in Dota 2. So I think in that sense, Sean Gers can kind of take some cues from him if he wants to build up his social media. So after that event, we had the MLG Columbus offline qualifier, which was held in Columbus, Ohio, in the MLG Arena, which I'd been to in the past for CEVOs. And I think also the group stage of MLG Columbus was played there before we went to that like nationwide arena, or whatever the Blue Jackets arena is called. And that's a cool little arena. It's very compact, but you can see how it totally works. You're obviously not going to have many fans, but the whole point is to just get in there, have a controlled environment, have good camera angles, get it all run. I thought it was pretty cool. And I wish there had been more events that could have been here. I wish that, because unfortunately this is around the time when they got Columbus, when MLG got bought by Activision Blizzard, and then since then they haven't been as involved in CS. It seems like they only want to come into CS now if they can get a major. So I think that's a shame, because I think MLG were very professional. I loved their approach to problem solving. I thought there was never any like problems at their events that seemed like they weren't legit. Like there was never any that seemed like it was directly their fault, and they always seemed to fix them fairly quickly and come up with good compromise. Like I noticed they were very good at changing the format when they heard people like me and others in the community saying, hey, why not try this in the format? So I thought it was a cool enough place. This event had tons of upsets, tons all over the place. Like the biggest one was obviously Splice qualifying, which by the way, most of you couldn't even mention half the lineup. Like, I'll give you a clue. Aria was in it. That's about all I'm going to say, because you wouldn't even know half the other players in this lineup. Splice qualified, despite the fact they were in a group where, in theory, every team in the group should have beat them. There was CLG, who at the time was pretty decent, and obviously went on to a top 8 at the major. There was their Danish SK, which was Pimp and Freese and Modi and those guys, who were actually a solid enough team, and a few months later would come second at CEVO P, and, you know, online had some decent results. Then there was Vexed, who was the Polish guys, who were basically the ones who I think before, it was like Hyper and those guys, right? And had qualified for majors in the past year. So they really should not have been getting out of here. And remember, they were actually not even supposed to be there. What happened was the Mongols had won IM Taipei, the Asia Minor, and their tournament visas, got declined, so they couldn't play in the tournament. And then CyberZen, which was the third place team, didn't have enough time to get visas because it was too short notice. And then Chiefs, who'd also finished top 4, who was like an Australian team, and Australia/New Zealand, hadn't been able to field a team at the time. Therefore, somehow the place fell all the way down in the American minor to Splice. So Splice got there. They had this ridiculous style where they were just shouting and screaming after every round one in a really obnoxious way. But fair enough, they were complete amateurs trying to make it in a pro tournament. And fair play, they did qualify, so you can't really fuck with that, right? Obviously, it did fuck all at the major, but listen, they already did more than they should have been able to by even getting to the tournament and then qualifying. Dignitas was a real shock that they didn't qualify. Yes, they were in a competitive group. They had Cloud9, Gambit, Renegades, but Renegades and Gambit weren't considered any big deal. Cloud9 was in a massive slump at the time. I really thought Dignitas at this point should make it. This was the Dignitas with Config and Kirby, who were playing very tactical, who'd actually, I think at this point in time, they'd already finished top 2 at that, what the fuck was it called? It was that tournament in Lithuania, the Cyber Cup or some shit like that. One of those names, you know. And yeah, they were definitely a solid enough team. They had good tactics, they had good team play. They still had Tensky at this point in time, obviously. I really am shocked that they didn't make it there. They were in a weird slump for a couple of months at this point in time. Gambit made it. This was the Hooch era, by the way. It wasn't Zeus. It wasn't half the players you're thinking of. Kind of shocking that they made it, but obviously they've turned out to be a half-decent team. They were more of an upset team overall. They never really did deep runs in big tournaments at this point in time, but they could always manage the odd upset, as they did here. Tempo Storm, later to be Immortals, shit the bed massively. Like, versus Flipside, who I don't think is a very good team. They played 2 maps and only won 10 rounds, and Henny got like 20 kills total over both 2 maps. And obviously this is like just before Katowice, where he had a very good performance. So I always thought Henny was fucking overrated anyway. But this was one of the worst examples of it, where he's playing not even a good team and he was absolutely shit in the bed, and a big reason why they didn't qualify for that major. Hellraisers almost made it. They were a round or two away from it, but obviously TL beat them. Team Liquid. Oscar was already carrying the fuck out of the team, but sadly, the rest of the team didn't really deliver and they couldn't qualify. Essentially the same core lineup as what you then later at the end of the year got with the squad that eventually would qualify for the E-League major, but obviously with Dead Fox instead of Oscar and like one other change, I think. Team Liquid, interestingly enough, Simple had like some good games, but some that were underwhelming. It was obviously their first big LAN with Simple. Behind the scenes, everything was going to shit in that team, and they were really wondering what we're going to do. And if we don't qualify, do we kick Simple? Do we stay with him? And they were having a lot of issues with him, Adren, and the others. Kusta had already signed, but he couldn't play at this point in time because, in theory, he'd won the minor or whatever with the nameless, formerly NME. I think they were Selfless, obviously, but formerly NME. This is the event where Richard was a host because Scoots couldn't make it, so we didn't have the old Gfinity Angels reunion. Richard swapped over to being the host, which he actually didn't do at many events. He used to do it at the DreamHack the year before. Obviously, he wasn't working with DreamHack anymore, and he would do it with E-League. But I always thought the best combo with me and him was usually where it was me, him, and then Scoots was the host, because then we could have a lot of fun with the banter because we were just the analysts, and we could go anywhere we wanted in the banter. And then also some events you have more than two people on the desk, even though personally my preference is two analysts and a host, because I think you just get more time and you get better synergy. This is actually, I think, the first event where I met Alchemist, the guy who has a long-time career from Gottfrag, friend of Scoots, obviously. At this point in time, he wasn't working with any of these big companies. He was still out of it. I mean, he talked about this in his reflections. And but he was gradually, like, figuring out how to get back into the equation, because obviously he has history with production and running a lot of things in CS, and he especially knows a lot about, like, observing that some of it's still not necessarily understood or appreciated to this day. Overall, just an alright event. I've never thought major qualifiers were that hyped, to be honest. That's why it wasn't a big deal for me to skip the one later in, well, it wouldn't have been 2016, it'd be for this year, wouldn't it? The one for PGL Krakow, even though it wasn't going to be held in Krakow. Then after that, in March, I had Counterpit, which was in Croatia. Now, I have to say, all that I saw of Croatia and all the area around looked very beautiful. Sadly, this is like a 2-day event with a very limited schedule and which really ran over its schedule each day. So I never had any time to explore. Like, for example, we had an amazing fucking hotel that looked super sick, but I only spent 5 hours in it each day sleeping, and that was it. And I had to be back at the event. So I never really got to experience much of Croatia. I don't know much about it. And obviously also the fact that I was there with Janko, who's from Serbia, and there's all the political tensions, and people were being kind of douchey to him, by the way, like shouting stuff in Serbian. I mean, I know they think it's Croatian, but it's just Serbian, not modified. They were kind of like shouting abusive shit at him and rude things at him, which I thought was pretty fucked. But you know what? We were ready to go anytime kids wanted to throw hands. But you know what? They all stayed in the crowd. What's the deal with that, eh? Now, one thing I will say was straight fire about Croatia. I don't know if this is a Croatian thing or if it's in Serbia as well. I think they have a version in Serbia. Was this thing called cevapi, which is like a sort of kebab. It's like a thing of bread with these like kebab, almost like sort of kofta type sausages, like those kebabs, if you know, from Turkey. And this is straight fire. It tasted fucking amazing, and the sauces that came with it were really good. So if you're ever in those countries, try one of those. It's really good, especially if you enjoy kebab. This event had a gangload of production issues. Obviously the first offline tournament they'd done with big teams, right? This is how bad the production was. We were doing the sound while doing the desk. Janko had the soundboard next to him, and he had to do the sound himself, which, by the way, did lead to some funny moments, because when the event was going to shit and we were bored and things were going wrong, Janko would sometimes fuck with the sound when the host was talking a little bit, or he just wanted to mess around with it a little bit. He did do that a little bit to keep himself amused, because he's a lad. This was the event that had that utterly ridiculous host, the one who was like, put your hands in the air, bloody war. That idiot. Like, yeah, that guy was there. I mean, that just seemed like one of those mafia movies where, like, you just have to hire someone for a job because he's someone's fucking cousin or something. Like, what is that? Why was that guy hired? Like, whoever thought that was cool, it wasn't. I mean, I realize in Eastern Europe they have a very different sentiment for what's cool. Like, if you ever see the fucking pop singers they have and some of the things they think's awesome in terms of the hosts of their talk shows, it's a bit weird. I'm not saying it's not weird in the West, by the way. I have some utterly stupid shit like Graham Norton in the West that, like, yeah, I don't really see what's fun about that or awesome about it. But, I mean, fuck American talk shows like Late Night and David Letterman. I've never understood what people thought was witty about this. It's the most lowbrow humor with, like, no discussion of anything meaningful for 2 or 3 minutes each, just basically sucking off some star and letting them advertise a movie. So listen, every region has its fucked up lowest common denominator of amusement, but this guy was a terrible host. I don't know what the fuck they were thinking of him as the stage host. Parler was our desk host, who I have to say, I had bad synergy with this guy. Like, I did my best. I really tried to help carry this guy when he had, because there was a lot of tech issues and a lot of filling, and he wasn't that good with it because he hadn't really done much hosting as far as I know. He was used to being a guy who did the interviews and stuff, and I have to say, even with the interviews, he used to prepare for them. He used to have his questions planned. He used to kind of get ready for it. He wasn't a guy who could do a lot of things on his toes, as it were, which might sound weird because you've seen him in his funny YouTube videos and you think, it should be a guy who should be able to roll with it. I actually think that's a weakness of his, though, and something that he's had to develop over the years with his interviews, and we had to do a lot of fucking filling. So we tried to do some good work here. I remember he had this like turtleneck on where I made a reference that he looked like Carl Sagan from Cosmos. He looked absolutely like him, by the way. Sadly, he didn't know the reference and just hung me out to dry on that. But as I said, bad synergy. He doesn't always work with every host. This was the event where VP was in a massive slump, but they kind of showed what VP at that point was like, where put them in a series against the top team, they still show up. So against Na'Vi, who ended up winning the event, and were a very, very good team at the time, probably second best in the world, they still managed to show up and make the games convincing. Unfortunately, the main player for VP who was in a slump at the time was Pasha, and he did absolutely shit the bed in the Na'Vi series and kind of was one of the main reasons they didn't have a chance to go on. At the time, they'd even had to take the AWP off him. He couldn't really use that. So he was just a bad rifler who overly aggressively pushed and just died a lot in those games. This was the event where famously NRG, Peter had his foot busted up on the plane over. They had to call in Tabson from Germany to stand in for them. This was the event, though, where they shockingly beat Envious, one of the best teams in the world. Tabson, he was the stand-in guy, came in with no preparation to play with them as far as I remember, and he went absolutely ham on the maps that they won and had really big performances there, and that's actually part of where I think he started to get overrated before he actually legit became very good at the beginning of this year. It was the first event Envious used Devil at, and he didn't perform particularly well, but I didn't blame him at that event. It was a brand new event, and they only played one best of three. This event was one of the worst I've ever seen Happy call. There was some abominable calls in this one, especially on Dust 2, where he just shit away their entire big chance to win, where a good in-game leader would ground out that T-side and just won the game with Kenny S going off, and Happy just fucked the whole thing up with stupid force buys and really ill-advised pushes into areas where they had no information to know where the opponents would be, and just shit the bed completely and gave NRG the free win pretty much, because on the map that Envious won, they dominated, so they absolutely could have won this series. Kenny S was going absolutely ham. This was really part of him, along with that event that was in Lithuania, starting to get his shit back together and starting to improve and get going again as a good player, as a potential superstar. For NRG, the Justin guy was pretty decent. Silent was actually shit for the whole event. People just remember he had that one ham round on Overpass at Catwalk Short, where he killed 4 people with mad spray. But aside from that, he wasn't a good player, and he so far has not shown himself to be a good player. Astralis managed to make it to the final, because obviously they only had to beat the NRG team, and I think Torpedo, or whoever the fuck they were from Sweden. They got to the final, and I actually thought they were going to beat Na'Vi in this one. They'd always done traditionally well versus Na'Vi. They'd matched up very well against them. Yes, they'd lost them at SLTV, Star Series, but Na'Vi was on an absolute heater there. This kind of showed for me the downturn of Astralis, because not only were they starting to lose some of their placings, but now they were also in a position where they were losing to teams they used to beat before. It wasn't just the elite teams that were beating them, like the Enviouses of the world, the Virtus Pros. They were in position to actually win this series 2-0 as far as I'm concerned. In the first map, which was Inferno, they won 12-3 T-side on the first half. That should be game right there, but they managed to lose. Let me think. No, that was the second map. They were already up 1-0 at that point. Yeah, so they could have won 2-0, but they fucked it up completely. Guardian was fucking insane in this final and for this whole tournament. He really was in insane form. He was the MVP of the tournament, probably the best player in the world at the time. Won them the tournament. Sadly, this is the tournament before the major, so you think to yourself, oh my god, he's going to go and win them the major, isn't he? He's going to be the best player at the major because he's been so good at the previous major, Cluj-Napoca. And you thought to yourself, Na'Vi can really challenge Fnatic and potentially win this major. Obviously, this is the last tournament we ever saw him in godlike form like that. So the next tournament was the major. It was MLG Columbus. Interestingly enough, I think it was Yanko's first ever major. Sadly, he didn't get to work the E-League major due to all the fuckery with politics going on behind the scenes there. I still don't really know, never got to the bottom of it myself. No one's ever explained it to me. I think this was his first major. Obviously, by this point, this was the year of Yanko. He already was a fantastic analyst, but it took him a few events to figure out some of the other elements, like when to do some banter. Also, me and him actually did have conversations where we figured out our roles, and I kind of told him, since you're so good at this, and since you're never going to get time to talk about 6 rounds, I will cede some of my time. I won't attempt to analyze some of the strategical things. I'll leave that all to you. You leave some of the map veto to me, and we'll put in some banter to lubricate this whole affair. And I think ever since then, that's why we've always worked so well on desks. It was also the first $1 million major. This was the one where they bumped the prize purse up. Now, this was the tournament where Nip got top 8, got a legend spot, but didn't feel like they had a real shot at this one because they had Pith in their team, but his visa issues meant they had to use Threat. But amazingly, they still finished top 8 because of how shit Mouse Sports and Flipside were. Mouse Sports and Flipside played probably one of the worst games ever played at the Major, that abomination overtime session on Cobblestone, which was just shit from everyone. I think Markov was going ham, though, and just really underwhelming as a map. And neither team were worthy, quite frankly, of any kind of exposure at that time. They were just shit. Team Liquid topped the group over Fnatic, shockingly. Part of it was due to the randomizer, as Hiko mentioned in his reflections. Splice and C9 were both terrible. Team Liquid was very sick. CLG was pretty good, making top 8. Splice and C9, pure shit. C9 at this point in time, yes, deservedly, they needed to make changes. Astralis had that shocking smash of Fnatic where Dupree was in God mode, one of the best series he's ever played. Carrigan did that epic pause, which I think is pure fucking banter when you consider how much shit the Fnatic guys talked in that particular squad that they had. They really went all in on it, and I went all in as a result. I really thought after watching that match, wow, they've broken this like curse they had. They've beaten, in theory, the #1 team. I thought they were going to win this tournament because they got Na'Vi next, which, yes, they had their issues with, but they've always been in position to win. They can win that, and then they can play Luminosity, and I think they could have beaten Luminosity. So I went all in. I predicted them. Obviously, they lost to Na'Vi in quite similar fashion, actually, to how they lost at Counterpit, sadly. The old Astralis returned for their old choking. That was the one. I can't remember if this is the one where they actually burst in. Device was like crying in the video afterwards, or maybe that was Cluj Napoca. I think it was this one, though. Na'Vi beat Astralis 2-0. The first map, Astralis had a breakdown, went on Mega Tilt. Na'Vi was just very good, ground it out, won the series, went to the final. Team Liquid beat CLG, where Simple went absolutely ham, showed off some amazing party piece plays. There was the knife on a JDM, I think it was, or was it Tarek? And then there was obviously that run boost on Cash to pick off JDM. Just insane shit. No one in their server could fuck with him in those games. Luminosity battled Virtus Pro. Admirable game again by the Poles. Took Luminosity not fully to the limits like they did in Cologne, but they took them close. They won a map off them. Luminosity beat Team Liquid. Now, those OT games, I have to say, anyone who wants to talk about like, Virtus Pro should have won the E-League Major. Well, in that case, Team Liquid definitely should have beaten Luminosity because theirs was even more convincing. They had the game where on Mirage it was practically won. It took that bullshit jumping set of no-scopes by Cold Zero to get Luminosity back in it. Otherwise, Team Liquid closes that map out. Both maps they could have won, Mirage and Cash. Yes, great performance by Luminosity to have the balls to hang in there, the grit to fight back, the ability to execute. Massive plays by Cold Zero, who was a fucking god in that series. Nitro really shit the bed overall, was terrible, and the start of his kind of problem child era with Liquid when they had Simple in the lineup as the star. Cash, Hiko was godlike on CT, but then terrible on T side. So they had their chances to win Liquid. They didn't. Luminosity came through, kind of fitting overall. I don't think Team Liquid really should have been in the final, despite the fact they played amazingly to get there. They had some great upsets, but I think it all evened out in the end. Na'Vi versus Luminosity was quite a depressing final because it had the potential to literally be the best final we'd ever had. In fact, the best match we've ever had in Counter-Strike. The maps were sick. It was like Mirage, Overpass, Train. 3 great maps for all 3 teams. Their best maps, arguably. I mean, yeah, you could say Cobblestone for Na'Vi, but they can definitely play all these maps. Unfortunately, Guardian's wrist was so fucked, and people didn't notice this because Flamey had carried the series against Astralis, that Guardian was already fucked. And in the final, he tried to compensate with his wrist injury by putting like 4 times his sensitivity, and he was terrible. He was getting out-orped by like Taco. Flamey went ham on the first map, Mirage, but got so tilted by them losing in overtime, I think it was overtime, that he basically just sat there through the whole break, just looking through his monitor because he was so depressed. Guardian finished the whole series with terrible stats. I think it was like minus fucking 20 or something. We had this promise that on Overpass, they said during the break they were going to do these crazy boosts they'd invented, because obviously they'd shown some amazing boosts in the semi-final versus Luminosity at IEM Katowice. Unfortunately, it turns out all their boosts were on CT side, I think, and they got their ship pushed in so hard on their T side that we just never got a chance to see them. So overall, quite a crap series. Props to Luminosity for winning. It's not their fault Fnatic and Na'Vi imploded. They just did what they needed to, won the tournament, and obviously this is their first massive tournament win. We did this bizarre all-star game where the cast was like, haha, what if the people who aren't casters were to cast the game? So like, that sounds like a funny gimmick or premise. And so the casters were Red Eye, me, and Richard. Now, that wasn't bad, but because the game was played on the new version of Nuke, which hadn't actually been released into competitive play at the time, it was a crap game. Now, there were some good moments of banter in it. There's a pretty good video out there with all the highlights. Like, one of my favorites is when Red Eye says something like, he's talking about Nuke, you know, and he says, yeah, it's a lot more T-sided now. And I go, the whole world is, Paul. Which, listen, I think that's straight fire. A little bit edgy, but also it's not entirely inaccurate, is it? Just one of the harsh truths of reality. So I think that was, by the way, one of the best majors we ever had, maybe the best. I thought it was fantastic from top to bottom. Amazing crowd, venue, great selection of teams, some very good matches. Okay, it didn't have all the best matches. Like the final was underwhelming, but beyond the matches, I think it was an amazing major. I wish MLG hosted more. They're one of my favorite companies in all of esports. A week after that tournament, we had DreamHack Masters Malmo. The first ever Masters, because at this point, DreamHack's already begun to fall out of favor a little bit in terms of all their events. So they made the Masters brand to kind of rebrand themselves. This is our premier tier 1 tournament. And this one lived up to it because it had an insane lineup of teams. The only one that wasn't really there was Fnatic, who were having their issues with Olafmeister, and were already going to have Plessenbier stand in for EPL or whatever it was. So it was already a tough situation there. And sadly, we didn't have Fnatic, who in theory were the world number ones. But we had all the other teams pretty much. Now, I think this was the first event I ever worked at with Metis, now known as Vince, for some bizarre reason. And I have to say, at the time, I didn't really know him that well, because as a guy, he's quite reserved and hadn't really gotten he hadn't opened up as much there. I think he has to get used to people, get a bit comfortable before you get to know him as a person. So it initially seemed a bit weird in that sense, but he's a good enough caster. I think he's actually very good for where he's at. For tier 2, I think he's way better than that. I think he should be tier 1, but for whatever reasons, he has his own health issues, and there's political reasons as to why, for whatever reason, he hasn't kind of teamed up with someone and made a good duo, which I absolutely think he could do. It was also the first event I worked with Machine. I think we had some pretty good banter. Like, we hadn't quite set the boundaries yet on what's too harsh, etc. So at this point, he still worked for ESL. He didn't necessarily want to throw too many haymakers. I got a lot of men on him. I remember there was a classic one where he said something about, we haven't seen Cash, and and I kind of make a joke about the fact that, yes, by the way, when he was at ESL, compared to us, he was very low paid and did not make very much, so I kind of wrecked him a bit on that. This is the tournament where Mouse Sports continued to surprise. Like, they won their group, even though you'd have looked at their group and thought there's no way they're going to win this. Like Luminosity and Team Liquid were in that group, 2 top 4 teams in the last major. Mouse Sports win the group, though. Obviously, Nico, sick player, one of the best in the world. Tai Lu amazingly made it out of the group. Like, they had a very weird CT style on Cobblestone versus, I think it was versus Team Liquid, where they just played this mega passive style inside the A site, but somehow it worked and they won the game, partly due to Kusta and Team Liquid just shitting the bed completely, and Simple really seemed off that tournament. He wanted to quit the team already. Team Liquid Kusta was a train wreck. Now some of it's bullshit. Like, the fact that Kusta couldn't AWP was also, like, he had confidence issues. It wasn't just that he had it taken from him by Simple. Godsent, shockingly, at this point we didn't know anything about them. They'd been shit online. Actually managed to get out of their group, a group that had Na'Vi in it, obviously one of the world's best teams. CLG were top 8 of the major. G2 had just kicked existence, but still had some very good players like Shox, etc., and Scream. So I think, actually, amazingly, not only did Godsent do a good run here, I think they could have made the final. They were very close in that semi against NIP to winning that tournament, and I think they just buckled a bit on stage because of the pressure, whereas we know the NIP Magic, they come through under pressure. That's one of the classic things about modern-day NIP when they weren't the top team anymore. Now, Na'Vi had to use Starix for the groups because of Guardian's injury, but then Guardian, bizarrely, like, flies in for the playoffs. Goes sick versus Tai Lu in the round of 8, so everyone's like, oh my god, Guardian's back. He wasn't at all. And even though they made it to the final, the way they lost the final, like, they beat Envious, who was already on a decline, and the way they lost the final was so depressing. They had both those maps won. They fell into threats like bait of the 4 spies. Guardian was not going at all in the final, and it kind of all went down to people like Seized, and so this should have been one of the big tournaments Na'Vi won, but they managed to fuck it up, and so they left the opportunity. NIP took advantage of it. Props to NIP. Envious, yeah, they got top 4, but mainly that was because Dignitas shocked their group and got out, and it was only really Kierby who turned up in that round of 8, and so Envious got to top 4, with Kenny S doing pretty well, but they still weren't legit world class. You could already see the decline. Astralis failed in the group because, first of all, they lost an upset game to Dig, I think it was on Cash, which is one of their less played maps, and then they lost the decider to NIP in classic fashion, the way that Astralis would always lose to NIP, where Device actually carried in this particular series, but then the rest of the team kind of shit the bed, especially on the 3rd map. They didn't close it out in 2, and therefore they went out, and this time in the group stage, and this was actually, I think, the first event they ever went out in the group stage. I think it was actually, yes. And that was a massive shock. Then you had NIP not only making it out of the group, but they went from strength to strength as the tournament went on. They beat Virtus Pro in a decent matchup. They beat Godsent in a very close matchup. They very, very narrowly beat Na'Vi, but managed to close them out 2-0, massively thanks to Exist having a big overperformance in the final. Anti-4 spy style from Threat was genius. It really baited out teams like, specifically Na'Vi, who were one of the teams more susceptible to it, and a team that should have saved and just run their executes, and they could have won off those, but also didn't help that their AWPer wasn't on form. VP, the fact they still always made playoffs kind of shows that this whole slump, as I made a video about, yeah, it was a slump for them, but for most teams that would be fine. It wasn't like a slump like they've had now where they're legitimately bad. The after party, by the way, for this tournament was fucking epic. This was the one where they let a bunch of us be DJs. And so Henry was a DJ and did like sort of an indie rock type set, which went fucking mental because we were all drinking tequila slammers the whole time. And he eventually had like half the crowd on stage with him. The stage was starting to fall over. They were just screaming the words to whatever song it was they were doing. He made like Sadikist have like a sexy dance off with some random person from the crowd or something. The whole thing went fucking nuts. Then I was on, and first of all, I turned up to the after party in an Astralis jersey because fuck everyone who's from Sweden, right? Just to trigger motherfuckers. Then for my set, I did like straight, like dirty, dark, neurofunk, hardcore drum and bass, proper like tech step. I was mixing it from like 2005 to 2009 sort of era. I was going straight bassline madness, and I was tearing the dance floor up as well. People was going fucking ham. And then during it, because there was a mic, while I was doing the tracks, I would also just shout random stuff like brutal, savage, wrecked, because that had just become a meme at the time. And also just at one point, I think I started the set by saying like, any Nip fans in the house? And obviously loads of these young Swedish kids go like, yeah. And I go, get the fuck out. No one likes Nip fans. Again, I'd had a lot of tequila at that point in time. But that was pure sickness. So I hope they do that again, because I would love to be a DJ at one of those ones. Sadly, I didn't go to Malmo this year due to scheduling, where I already had 2 events booked. So I thought it was a fantastic event, one of the events of the year for sure. Shame Fnatic didn't turn up, because that would have added a little bit more prestige to it and made it so all the good teams were there. A lot of upsets as well, you notice. And I don't think NIP were ever as good as they were at that tournament, quite frankly. After that, in April, towards the end of April, we had the Gfinity CEVO Season 9 Professional Tournament, whatever you call it. Well, it was basically CEVO Season 9. I'd already done 7 and 8 with MLG in Columbus in America. And this one was hosted by Gfinity. It was the last event that Richard did before he joined E-League, which we kind of knew was coming, but we didn't really know what that would mean. Unfortunately, there was no Scoots. Like, I can't remember if he just couldn't attend or what. We had Pocket, I think, for some of the event. I think just some, though. And he obviously hadn't done that many events. Like, actually, I don't think he'd ever done an event with us. It's the first time I think we worked with him, because obviously he comes from Call of Duty. But I think he did a good job. Obviously, he has fantastic showmanship and really good on-mic skills. He's a true professional, and he's actually a cool guy as well. Like, funnily enough, here's a little detail about Pocket people won't know. When he first met us and he was doing those first like CEVOs and stuff, right, he really is, personality-wise, he is like a fucking American Boy Scout. It's disgusting. He's like Clark Kent of like 60s Superman comics. So at first in those green rooms, he'd be like, gee guys, I don't know if we should be talking like that and making jokes like that. Yeah, yikes, is it hot in here? But then eventually, after he'd sort of been conditioned to the sickness of what our green rooms are like when me and Richard are there, like the straight fire, just straight fire banter. Put it this way, good job we never get hot mic'd in those motherfuckers. Eventually, he sort of loosened up and he started to enjoy it. And well, I think what he had to learn eventually was that seems very harsh. So people think, well, those guys are just really terrible people. But what you had to realize is we just have a dark sense of humor. And it's also a British thing as well if you come from a working class background. And actually, yeah, we're obviously good guys, depending on who you talk to. And so I think once he got to know that, he kind of understood it was humor. And then he got into it a little bit himself. He got kind of corrupted by the sickness, down with the sickness, as it might be said. This was the tournament where VP was there, so you'd think, well, surely they're going to win this fucking tournament. You looked at it, there weren't any elite teams there aside from them. Amazingly, they lost to Hellraisers with Oscar in the group, almost lost to Splice, who had changed the lineup a little bit, but fucking hell, and then lost to Tempo Storm in a best-of-5 semi-final where it went to all 5 maps, and I think they really shit the bed by losing them. But I also think Tempo Storm, at this point in time, was starting to solidify into a good team, actually, beyond the team that I thought was a bit fluky at Katowice and never made it to the major, by shitting the bed and Henny just doing fuck all, like he does in a lot of games. Dignitas failed in the group of this tournament as well. Like, the fact they didn't make it out of this tournament mega far just showed that there were some real problems. Despite how good that lineup was tactically and how good Kirby was, there were some real issues. Config's role wasn't really set properly. MSL was a fucking bot. They had Tensky still. In theory, you were making Rubino be like your third best player, which didn't always work. It was much better when he swapped over when they later got him Magisk. They failed this event massively. SK was in their group and made it out. The Danish team, they made it to the final, which actually helped Pimp get over to Team Liquid, because I was talking to him during these games. I've always known him. He's always been a mate of mine. I was saying, like, what's your contract like? What's your buyout like? I went to Team Liquid. Obviously, I knew Hiko there. A few of those people, I knew they needed a player to replace Simple. I was like, at least consider Pimp. He's someone who can probably play different roles. If you want people like Nitro to still have star roles, I know that he's very eager to get back to the top. They don't necessarily let him have all the spots he wants in SK. Eventually, that was able to happen. Part of SK getting to the final was Modi had like a huge throwback tournament. Reminded me of like, first of all, like what he would do later in Heroic, and then what he'd done in 1.6, where he was like actually like a legit carry in terms of his AK. He was pretty strong at this tournament. So SK making the final was pretty shocking. Tempo Storm won the event, but like I said, they were actually becoming a very legit team, a real top 10 team. They actually learned to train on the fly at the tournament. They had no T-side, but they were able to get through some big games on it. Phelps had his first, what I think is superstar performance. This is when I first noticed this guy could actually become one of the top 10 players in the world, which I think he maybe accomplished earlier this year, finally in SK. He didn't always live up to his potential in Immortals, because I think they didn't necessarily know how to use him, because they didn't have good in-game leadership. But I think a fantastically talented player. And I think give him a couple of years, when someone like a Cold Zero or a Fur either goes down in level or steps down or leaves the team, he will be one of the best players to ever play from Brazil. His talent level's fucking unbelievable. Bolts actually was the MVP of this tournament, largely due to how well he played in the final, and he was in-game leading for the first time. They had Peacemaker still, but this is the tournament where, because remember, you could still have the coach be the in-game leader, where they let Bolts be the in-game leader, and Bolts played like fucking a good in-game leader and like prime Crims. He was really smart at this. He was fantastic in the final, helped them win it definitely. And yeah, another tournament where you saw that this is a very different Bolts to the one that used to play in Luminosity and was kind of at times a liability and looked a little bit shook in big games. Now he looked pretty clutch, and I think he has to this day been one of the better players in that team, one of the more reliable ones, and definitely one with a really good attitude. After this, I was actually gonna go and do, I think it ended up being the EU Minor, the one that was like DreamHack Tours, but it's one of the only times I've ever agreed to do an event I actually pulled out, where what happened was PGL, Silvio, contacted me and said, we're doing the Asia Minor, and it's going to be in Seoul in South Korea. And since I fucking love South Korea, at this point in time, obviously I was only like 4 or 5 months removed from having lived in Korea for like quite a lot of months out of the last 2 years at this point in time. I definitely want to go back. It has the best food. It's such a sick place, great nightlife, got friends over there. So I actually asked DreamHack, and they were very accommodating, and they let me essentially just swap out and go and do this event instead, and they took someone else for tours. So I went and did this one. It wasn't a great tournament because of the Asia Minor, but first of all, it was in Seoul again. Like, the food in Seoul, some of the best in the world. The Korean barbecue there, as long as you know where to go to get your galbi and to get your samgyeopsal and bulgogi, you got to know the different places for each type. It's fucking amazing, and it can be really cheap if you know what you're doing. And another food that people don't know about, and I got Natu to try at this event, my old mate Natu, was jimdak, and that is fantastic. It basically means steamed duck, and it's a sort of a broth slash stew with these like potato noodles and potatoes and carrots and steamed chicken, rather, not duck. And it doesn't sound that great when I describe it like that, but it's fucking really delicious because this soy sauce like marinade that it comes in is so goddamn good. But you need 2 people to eat it because the plate is massive, and it's the ultimate hangover food. So I took Natu for it as like a hangover meal. He appreciated it as well because he loves Korea too. And actually, interesting enough, Natu came primarily because it was a Korean event and PGL. You notice he does a lot of work with them. They have a good relationship. He's a guy I've known for a long time. I actually, I think I probably said this in the last video, but I actually lived with him for a few months in 2004. He's a really old school pro. I've known him all throughout 1.6. I actually knew him long before I knew Lurpus. So he was my original Finnish homie. Although minor shout out to Missa, who's just a G. This was one where also another reason I want to do the event is because Kan Yang was there, and he is a legendary guy in the 1.6 scene for doing lots of events in China and Korea. He used to be behind WEG, WEM, World Esports Games, World Esports Masters, and the key thing about his events is he's always dressed like a gangster, like he just looks straight G'd up out of some, like he's out of fucking LA or something, but he's a Korean guy, and he's a really cool guy, and he's the ultimate guy to party with. And he took us to this bar that had this famous barman who used to run this infamous bar that the people who went to WEG events used to always go to, where they give you these ridiculous drinks where you get super wrecked off it. Like, they'll give you a drink where they say, like, drink this really quickly, and they set it on fire and say, you got to drink it before it goes out. So you think, like, oh, it's urgency. And as you're drinking it, they just throw loads of shots in. So you just go from, like, 0 to fucking 60 in, like, 10 seconds. And next thing you know, 10 minutes later, you're just completely out of it. So fun stories came out of that. Unfortunately, can't repeat many of them here. Not even just because of my own, my own component in it, but because there's other people who wouldn't like those stories revealing, quite frankly. The host for this event was Duffer, James Duffield, who's a guy who worked for Twitch. I think he's a decent enough host. I guess his style is like supposed to be a little bit cringe, a little bit awkward, so that's fine. Unfortunately, there wasn't that much meat at the tournament. Tai Lu won the event. I will tell you this story without mentioning any names, okay? There was a really funny moment at the after party where some players from Vichy, who remember are the second best Chinese team, the one with like TB and Savage, like those X1.6 Tai Lu players, came up and they were talking to some players from Renegades, and they were saying like, oh, we shit this event, we shit, because they had like broken English, but at least they had some English because there'd been a lot of events. And they were like asking for a picture of me and stuff, because I remember them from 1.6. And when they say like, we shit, someone just says to them like, no, you do well, you win the event. And then, because this person has mistaken them for the Tai Lu players who won the event over Renegades. And then those players go, no, we Vichy, we no win. And it was just mad awkward, because obviously that guy doesn't know the difference between all the Chinese players. Basically just congratulated the team that Renegades has beaten, when actually, obviously they haven't won the event at all, and they're not from Tai Lu. In that tournament, Tai Lu looked decent. This is when I still thought they had a good lineups before they made the roster moves and all that fucking split happened. I think at this point in time, they were a good team. They just needed more experience in Europe. They won in reasonable fashion from the lower bracket, but like their map pool wasn't that convincing. And I still think they hadn't figured out necessarily how to pick maps yet, because they were so good against everyone domestically. Vichy, the second best Chinese team, had no concept of how to play some of the maps like Cash. They had no clue of what the meta was or what you did. They tried to just frag people. And while they had some good fraggers like Zoking, etc., and Savage, it wasn't enough. I think Renegades actually choked this event. I think Renegades was the best team at the tournament and they should have won, but they choked away the final and were kind of underwhelming. Like Azza would have a monster half. They'd have a shit half where he'd do nothing. Some of the other players in that team always struggled. I think Sponge was still having his issues. I think some of them outside of the game, which probably affected inside the game. After that, not long after that, a couple of weeks later, was E-League Season 1. But you didn't see me at the beginning of E-League Season 1, did you? Because when I applied for my visa, despite the fact, if you think of all the people applying, I was actually the most qualified to get the visa to do that job. I'd done more events than most of the other people. I'd been in esports longer. I'd had many jobs in esports. I'd even worked for American companies, CBS obviously with On Gamers. So even though we gave them all this evidence, I didn't get my visa initially. And the initial kind of report back from the lawyers involved in all this was like, oh, we're pretty sure this must mean either it's someone brand new at the job, so they don't know what they're doing, or someone has something against esports. That's why you didn't get your visa. So we reapplied. They even had to get like some higher up people involved with ensuring I got it. I got it eventually a few weeks later, and I came to E-League, I think for like week 3 or something, or week 3 or week 4. So in the meantime, they had Dust and Mo as kind of the stand-ins. They were on deck because they live in America, so they don't need visas. That's the only reason those people were there, by the way. At no point in time was it ever planned for Mo to be involved in E-League until it became clear that I had a visa issue. Because, by the way, part of it is E-League was kind of left it a little bit last minute to let us apply for these visas. So some of it falls on them as well. But all these stories you might have heard about, oh, they loved Mo and they were going to keep him, and initially it was going to be a rotation. None of it's true. It was always from day one planned to be Richard, me, and then Moses came on last, but it was going to be us 3 on the desk, as you saw for all of E-League beyond that, and for the E-League Major. Mo was there as a stand-in, and I think he did a pretty good job as a stand-in. I think he did a good job with the banter. Analysis, listen, you don't have much time for in-depth analysis on those games anyway. I thought he did a good job. Now, after I came, they were never going to mix him into the equation anyway, but it certainly wasn't good timing for him that he tried to kind of provoked me on Twitter a bit, because then when I saw what went down with him and that CSGO Diamonds shit, I contacted CSGO Diamonds, got all the story. He motivated me to be an investigative journalist, and I ripped him a new asshole and pretty much did like a fatality out of Mortal Kombat on him and turned him into a little babality, you know. So that was the end for him. He's never going to be with E-League after that. When I first went to E-League, we had to like live in a hotel, admittedly a very nice hotel, so that was good. But there's a bizarre thing in American hotels where they never provide enough light. Like there's no big fluorescent light. So lighting for videos is a fucking nightmare. If you ever go back and see some of the videos I did there, it's terrible. I'm in shadow all the time. After that, we did get like our own apartments, which were fucking awesome. These like furnished apartments, like for people who are corporate apartment housing, you know. It was really, really high level, fantastic. I really enjoyed living there. It made my life a lot better. Unfortunately, the first few weeks, I had a really bad time with the sleeping schedule. I have insomnia at a lot of these events. Like it's actually standard that I get 4 to 5 hours a night sleep at most events. Especially I never tried using sleeping pills for most of these years. And so I'm just a trooper. I just get up, I have my energy drink, I just get on with it and do the best I can. But I was having a really bad time these first few days. Like the first couple of weeks, a mixture of jet lag and then just some other issues meant that I actually had some days I went in and did a full 14-hour day after 1 or 2 hours sleep. And some of those were rough. Some of those were really tough. I wish I'd known back then about G Fuel, because at the time I used to just use normal energy drinks and those wear off after a few hours and eventually they don't do anything anymore. Whereas I found with G Fuel, if I have 2 G Fuels, one in the morning and if I've got a really long day, one roughly about 4 or 5 hours before the end, I don't ever nod off. I will feel tired sometimes, but the difference is others, I've got so many pictures of Yanko and Moses and all of them similar, curled up on couches, literally sleeping during matches because their body can't hold up anymore. Ever since I got on the G Fuel, that's never happened to me. But unfortunately, at this point in time, I hadn't actually discovered G Fuel. I think I got it in the summer and took it for season 2, I think. And that was part of why I was so productive in season 2, and I did an insane amount of content from that apartment. And so another killer with my sleep schedule at this point in time was, for some stupid reason, E-League had it so that, and they still do this to this day as far as I know, even if you're going to have a 14-hour day, they will make you come 2 hours early for a production meeting and then an hour and a half wait for the thing. Now, the production meeting is mainly for camera people and the directors and maybe the host, but they make everyone come to this and you have to sit there with a rundown of all the shots and stuff. And I have to say that is lame, because your workload is so huge, you can't be adding extra time like that. It just wrecks you, especially because I get it for inside the NBA. You're going to do 1 or 2 games max. It's going to be 4 to 5 hours most. Then people can come an hour early. You can't come an hour early if you have to work all day long and get up really early. And some of these meetings, you have to leave at 7:30 in the morning, start the meeting at 8 a.m. So some of these were ridiculous that you had to do. That's one thing I did take liberty with in E-League, and I always fucking complained like a cunt about them. Obviously, the desk was me, Richard, and Moses. Now, I think we'd done some of that at MLG, but obviously we had Scoots at the time. Had we done it at the qualifier? I think maybe we'd done it at the qualifier, though, when Scoots couldn't make it. So I think that's a pretty good combo. Obviously, there's good banter between all of us. We're all friends. We all get along well. Moses has a great laugh, which I always think adds massively to any desk because it's going to make it more fun when he's going off. Obviously, he can play the role of the guy who has to do the analytical stuff as well. This was a tournament where Stewie really broke out as a star player from NA, because his team was still pretty shit, still had Slemmy, but he was having massive performances. The team actually, in some ways, hinted towards what they were going to do later, because they managed to take Na'Vi super close in that quarterfinal game and barely lost. G2 was still very strong, but showed some flaws because Shox and Stream were carrying. They were doing super sick, but it ended up being really costly that they didn't win that final group game against NiP and get the automatic round of 8 spot, because when they came back for the last chance qualifier, that was where they had to bring Fuchs as the stand-in. I can't remember who. I think it's instead of RPK, right? And they still barely lost to Mouse with Nico going ham, but they did lose in the last chance qualifier, therefore didn't get to the playoffs despite being one of the best teams of the year. Mouse Sports won the last chance qualifier. Obviously, we saw some insane shit in that phase 1, like when Nico did that ridiculous D-glace. Managed to amazingly beat Astralis, which really kind of signaled the end of the Carrigan era, to get to the top 4. Nico going godlike in that series. Had been one of the best, in my opinion, he was the best player in the world at the time. And his performances in this tournament were also pretty sick. Unfortunately, they got rocked by VP and he couldn't do much there. But VP at the time was, at this point in time, they were arguably the best team in the world. They were about to take the spot from SK. Fnatic looked good again throughout the whole tournament. They started slow with Olofmeister, worked their way back into it, crushed Envious completely, crushed Na'Vi, and in a way where you could see the psychological effects were there again, but they were also just dominant, doing all the Fnatic things. Amazingly, they got destroyed by VP by doing a very arrogant veto where they gave VP maps that VP wanted to play and therefore got their shit pushed in by VP. Dignitas shit the bed again in the whole tournament. World Edit set the world record because he was playing versus fucking Echo Fox offline on train. That Echo Fox team, I made an article about it. It was one of the worst teams I've ever seen that actually had money and in theory professional contracts. If you let World Edit set world records, you already know there's issue there, because that guy's hard stock in tier 2, isn't he? Envious started to play around Kenny S by the time the playoffs came, beat VP, made the playoffs but lost to Fnatic. VP, because they lost to Envious in the final of the group, had to actually go and play in the last chance qualifier, but easily got through that. And then in the playoffs had one of the most insane runs they've ever had. That was Virtus Plow again, because it so incorrectly uses the term. This was Virtus Plow. They 2-0'd everyone they played, from NIP to Mouse Sports to Fnatic in the finals, and they crushed everyone, won all the maps, including their opponent's map every time, looked fucking sick. Taz, by the end of the tournament, was in insane form for someone who in theory is the worst player in the team. And just, it looked like, wow, VP's had that, they got kick-started again at the major, and now they're back, and this is where they became the best team in the world, even though they didn't win that many tournaments, just one dream at Bucharest after this. For Na'Vi, it was actually the end of that lineup, that classic lineup, one of the best teams of all time, but didn't win many tournaments. Obviously, the way they got beaten by Fnatic, coupled with losing to Simple and Team Liquid at the major, they decided to pull the plug on Zeus, to go ahead and get Simple, thinking they would have Starix. Obviously, that in theory could have done a lot if they'd had that proper lineup. I think that era could have been fantastic for them. Got cut out from beneath them because obviously Valve took care of the coaching rules in that sense. One thing I will say was great about E-League, by the way, is at the time, I was still a big Candy fiend, something I've actually managed to wean myself off now. Maybe I should do a video on that actually sometime. People think might be interested to know my philosophy. And they used to always have little baskets of candy, but they didn't always have the ones I wanted. So what I did is I basically managed to find out where the candy storeroom was. And even though you're not supposed to go in there, I would just fucking go in there. And if someone would come in like, excuse me, can I help you? I'd go, just have a little look, please. And I would just go through all these boxes of candy, get all the sick candies you want, Swedish Fish, M&Ms, everything. Like fucking Reese's peanut butter cups, don't know if they had those, but they're straight fire. Get all those, just go in with a massive armful, because since I was there for like 12 hours at a time, I would just be drinking energy drinks, sodas, and smashing candy. So I was going off the chain. Like we used to literally say, like Moses would always say, like, oh fucking hell, you've just had your second rock star, haven't you? Because I'd be going completely ham, like ridiculous banter, just going completely off on people, talking about the maddest shit ever, going off in a fun way, by the way. Obviously it was all entertainment, banter. I was never wrecking anyone or anything like that. And so, yeah, it was fun in its own way, E-League. Then, during E-League, this is what's bizarre about the timeline, we had ESL 1 Cologne. And this was obviously the first event in CSGO I ever worked with ESL with. And you think yourself, wait a minute, that's not true. You went to ESL EMS 1 Katowice in 2014, right? No, because obviously I was fired before the first day even began, and they never paid me for that event. So, no, I never worked at that event, actually. I just went to Red Eyes Hotel, had talked to him for an hour, and then sat in my hotel for 4 days and decided in the back of my mind, I will never set foot in Poland in my life ever again. And that's actually one of the compelling reasons, thanks to the fact that I have so many options in my career and it's been so successful, that I don't have to attend events in Poland, even if they're majors, and I won't. So one of the first times I worked with ESL, because they had a really good pitch to get me on board to work with them, which is they said, we weren't there when all that stuff went down. We might handle it differently. That's all been and gone since then. They actually explained the funny story I think I've mentioned in a different video, where it turns out ESL did try to bring my name up to hire me again in future events. It's just that every time they would bring my name up, someone would be like, yeah, but have you seen what you just said about me on Twitter yesterday? And it'd be like some ridiculous burn, like, you are a bitch and you'll never accomplish it. It'd be like some super harsh burn. That's what kept me from being hired, apparently. So they did a really good job. They were like, listen, it's not the IEM group. This is the ESL 1 group. We're different people. We want to work with you. It'll be mutually beneficial. And I was like, yeah, you know what? It is a different set of people. Let's make some great events again. So this was one where I got to do some of my intros, and I think some of them turned out pretty sick. Like I particularly like the Virtus Pro one. I think I really did a good job on that one. I will say it's a bit off that they were narrated by Joe Miller, because even though he has a great voice for CS, I thought it was going to be like, one of those movie trailer guys. So I wrote it with the pacing for a movie trailer guy, and he kind of just read it in his own pacing as how he would with like a Northern English accent. So some of them didn't always work exactly how I wanted them to. I also think no one to this day has still done those videos how I want them to be made. That's why I want to do some with Snipe now, where I want to do like longer narrative pieces, like 5 minutes long, where you can really go deep on that shit and you have all the footage behind it. And so I started to do some of those, but I'm still working on how to get them done properly, because they've been a bit too short for some of these events. Some of these events just tell me you get like 3 sentences, try and make them snappy, or make it 60 seconds long. So you can do something with that, but you can't go very deep. You have to pick kind of one theme and start to sketch that out, basically. Obviously, it was a major, super stacked major. Pretty much all the good teams were there. SK were the favorites, and it was really era-defining that they won it, and in such dominant fashion. I actually predicted they would win the tournament. I really thought that they were going to. I think they had all the facets, especially their map was fucking insane at the time. Especially because they'd been able to integrate Cobblestone in, and now even their DOS 2 was decent. So the cash as their ban meant they almost couldn't be beaten in the map veto by anyone. VP was the only team that could come close. They had a really sick run through the tournament. They were only really challenged by Virtus Pro, and I think Virtus Pro had an epic fail picking Nuke, even though it later became a mega map for them. That was really big for Virtus Pro. At this point, they fucked up by picking Nuke. Instead of picking, I think Train was the map they should have picked. Then they would have given them a chance to 2-0, but they didn't. Fnatic still looked really strong. I think people underplay how good Fnatic were at this tournament. They were still a really good team. They crushed the Gambit team so easily. They did Fnatic things to get out of the group. They would have made the final if Simple hadn't just gone fucking bonkers in that semi-final. That's what really denied them it. And unfortunately, I think they would have lost to SK in the final, which could have been a great final, by the way. And I think they actually denied SK the storybook ending to what would have been their era, which is that you beat Fnatic, the team they'd never beaten in the best of three, in the final, and you cement your era that way. We're the best team. We're maybe even one of the best teams of all time. Unfortunately, instead, Team Liquid went on and got smashed, obviously, quite easily in the final. G2 were real outsiders to do a deeper run at this tournament. They just won ECS. They'd already won a whole bunch of maps off at Luminosity/SK, but they were in the group of death, and they were the main victim of the group of death. The group of death was the one that had SK, Fnatic, G2, so 3 of the top 4 teams in the world, and FaZe, who at the time, yes, they didn't have Karrigan, they weren't the good FaZe now, but they had very dangerous players for upsets, and obviously they did upset Fnatic. So quite sad overall, I think, that G2 was put in that group. I think they could have had a deep playoff run otherwise. And obviously that's one of the reasons why Shock still has that record of not having made it out of the groups since, like, I mean, it must be Katowice 2015, right? Liquid had an amazing run. This was the most inspired of all their runs because obviously Simple was a stand-in and had played ECS, and now this time it wasn't even a main member of the team anymore. They had JDM, who wasn't doing that well, but they just integrated into the team. And let me think. Oh, Peacemaker was the coach, and he was in-game leading. I think he did a good job of in-game leading at this tournament. Now, first of all, Simple at this tournament was fucking godlike. He's been very good at a lot of the majors, and in this one, he was absolutely one of the best players in the whole world. What he did against Na'Vi and then against Fnatic, unbelievable shit. He's someone where, again, it's not even his team at this point in time. Elige started to really come online and was particularly good against Fnatic. This was also another great accomplishment for Hiko, who was the most decorated player in NA history, partly because of his mentality to want to win and to want to surround himself with people who will do anything that it takes to win, which has meant sometimes surrounding himself with people like Simple, who's very abrasive, like Elige, who you have to deal with his own personality foibles at this point in time, different coaches, but he's done what it took to succeed, and yes, maybe he wasn't that good at this point in time, but he got the accomplishments as a result of that mentality, and I think it's kind of fitting that he got the best placing ever for an NA team at a major. Then you had, this was kind of the beginning of the end for Na'Vi. Like, they could have 2-0'd it. They almost won on Nuke, which was a map they played in overtime. If they 2-0 there, I think they would have had a really good chance against Fnatic. Would have been a great semi. Obviously, they never got there. They went out in the round of 8 here. Team that was used to making top 8 or top 4 all the time. I think the fact that they got bodied by Simple in massive games, particularly that third game, is also a big reason as to why they were like, we have to get this guy. That's why at that tournament, even though, by the way, the reason why I said it was so shocking that they'll have to get Simple one day is because behind the scenes, all the Na'Vi players for years had said, we'll never have that guy. You know, he's a bad teammate. We don't need him. We've got players that are as good as him. Well, after this tournament, when I said that comment, one day, mark my words, he will play for Na'Vi. It's because I could just tell, looking at Na'Vi, looking how far they now were from being number one, and the problems they were having in their team with Guardian, if you're a team that's got mainly Ukrainian and Russian players, you have to get Simple. He's just too fucking good. He's the ultimate weapon where you could put him against a Fnatic or an SK and have a chance to win, potentially. VP, obviously, this sparked their return, getting to the semis and having that. They had a very narrow game, people forget, against Astralis, where they barely won, and Device was going really carrying. Then in the semis, they almost beat SK. They played really well in the first and third map, shit the bed on their own map of Nuke, but really strong return. This was the strongest of all the series they played all year, and obviously after that, they went to E-League, smashed the tournament, and became the number one team in the world. Astralis was kind of a non-start because Dupree couldn't play due to some sort of health issues. They had to use Glaive, who did frag very well, and obviously... No, wait a second. Yeah, there was something else as well. Oh, they couldn't use Kirby, that's right, who they'd signed. So they had to use Glaive, and they had to use Zonic, that's right. Zonic played all right. I mean, he's obviously just a coach. They amazingly, like, they did get upset in their group, but they got out. They almost beat VP and made top 4, so got the Legends spot again. Gambit had a complete fluke to get to top 8. This is why we need to remove best of ones to win out the group. They wouldn't win a best of 3 against Astralis or Dignitas. I'm sorry. I know you might think they do, but I don't think they would have. This is back when they had Hooch, etc. still. And I don't know, Waylander wasn't in their team at this point in time. They had like Smike or someone. They weren't a good team. And it was a mad fluke that they made top 8 and they got shit on by Fnatic completely in the round of 8. Machine did his epic burn on me where he was like, 20-minute video, 2 minutes of content or whatever. Now you have to realise, First of all, it's a pretty good burn. Like there's a grain of truth in there for if people who don't like my videos, and obviously it's a famous thing that people who don't like my videos would say. But first of all, it is a joke. Like Machine himself got a bit mad in the days later in that event. Like, why are people making out like I've actually burned you and I don't like you? Like this is just a joke. And I was like, I know that, mate. Don't worry about that. Also, you have to realize the context there. I always say this to people who I work with on desks, especially new people, so I get them on board with the mentality. I say to them, you have to be able to take a hit every now and then. You can't win out on every interaction. So in that setting, he made that joke at the end of the day when they're literally telling us in our ears, like throw to the commercial or whatever, like end of show. And because of the timing when he said it, like he didn't purposely do this to wreck me entirely, but the timing is that there's no time left for me to do a comeback. Also, we've already had banter. I'm not just going to keep it going forever. So there's no time to go like, yeah, but what about you being shit? Yes, no. You have to, on that one, he's landed at the final, at the buzzer. He's landed at the buzzer beater. There's no shots left to be taken. You've got to just take it on the chin. You got wrecked. Great. Move on with your life. Everyone gets their chances to come back future times. So, one last story I'll tell about this event is this was the event where some clips got uploaded, I think by Seized or Adren, where it was some phone clips where after the after party, we were all in our hotel, a bunch of like CIS players and me, and we were shooting the shit as we do. What some players like to do, some pro players, is they'll try and like debate with me about CS. Now, usually, I'm not a massive fan. I don't mind bantering, but like when I'm at an after party, I don't really want to talk about fucking CS, unsurprisingly. There's other things in life that I would rather talk about or pursue. And so in this setting, a bunch of them were talking with me, some of them talking friendly with me about who do you think is the best player on my team, what do you think I should do. But I got into this debate with like Kane and Hooch from Gambit at the time, and I've known him a long time, he's a good guy. And this guy, Kane, comes over. And at the time, I'm like, I remember the name Kane, but I don't know who this guy is. I'm thinking, who the fuck is this guy? He keeps coming over really drunk and keeps like being really obnoxious, like, you don't know anything about the CS. And I'd just say something, all right, what don't I know about? And he'd mention something, and I would know the fact and the detail, and the stats. I go, yeah, what next? And then I'd ask him something. Yeah, you don't know about that, do you? You don't know shit. And he's one of those guys who kept using the logic of like, he's the coach who's done everything in this team, and if you don't agree, then you just don't know about CS and his team. It's like a classic approach that players will take because it avoids actually having a debate and really having to make points and make solid arguments. You just say, well, you're not in my team, so you can't know. And then you try to deny all the results, because, we can't know what made that the case, but we can know what the case is, like what's going wrong in the team and who's bad, etc. You can absolutely make those qualitative judgments. So it was all banter to me. I never saw this as a big deal. I know the flip side people like tried to sort of like punish him for this or something, or were a bit mad at him because there was videos of him being drunk, just belligerently arguing with someone. But I thought it was all fun. I've even seen that guy since. I thought it was pretty funny all in all. And I mean, he was talking a lot of nonsense, but it was a fun time. We were all laughing, by the way. We all thought it was funny. We were even playing a game where every time he would get wrecked, someone would keep count, and I was wrecking him completely. And he tried to do that old football move of like, last goal, the winner. And then if he got one right, all right, we leave it there, I win. It's like, yeah, you didn't know, did you? You got bodied. After that, in September, because remember, E-League was the playoffs followed on after ESL and Cologne. I did Gfinity Invitational, which was at EGX, which was a sort of trade show in the NEC, this big arena place in Birmingham, which apparently is like the size of like 20 football pitches, regulation size, is mental. So it takes like 10 minutes to walk across it. This was the beginning of Gfinity starting to drop off in terms of the quality of the teams they could get, because obviously the format was like the Champion of Champions event the year before, but guess what? They didn't have the Champion of the Champions. So they had Envious, okay, still a pretty decent team, underwhelming performance at the major. And they were still good, but they were also underwhelming. Like, they almost lost to fucking Epsilon, who, yes, they had all the Epsilon players at this time. None of them had left, but they weren't that good a team. Apex and Kenny S had to straight carry both the series to win them the tournament. Mouse Sports finished second. This was the first tournament they took Oscar. I was really excited about this because I know how good Oscar can be now, and I've seen it now since. And I thought him and Nico together, that would be the pairing where these two will it'll be like some action movie. Like, I used to carry in, my team used to let me down. I used to carry, my team used to let me down. Let's team up and beat these motherfuckers. So I thought it was going to be like when Maverick and Iceman teamed up and fought the Russians and took down the MiGs, Sadly, Oscar, for some bizarre reason, really shit the bed in this tournament. Now, Nico was still a beast. He wrecked Godsent. Epsilon was decent. You saw the makings of some of the players being good, but they didn't do as well as they probably should have if they wanted to get into teams quickly. It was a real opportunity for them against Envious. And Godsent was just shit. This is when they had Crims back in the team. They had JW, Flusher, Crims, and they were absolutely terrible as a team. Yeah, they got some decent maps against Mouse, but Mouse was not a good team in their own right. Let's see. I've only got a few events left here. So about a week after that, I did ESL 1 New York, my second event for ESL. Great location, downtown Brooklyn, The Barclays Centre, obviously a pretty cool place if you know anything about the Nets and the Islanders. I have to say, one thing that was underwhelming about this area is, like, I grew up with, like, 90s, 80s hip-hop, right? So I'm listening to, like, B.I.G., I'm listening to all this shit, and I'm thinking, fucking hell, Brooklyn, BK, this is going to be some straight fire, right? You got to watch out. There's going to be, like, hoods all over the place, like, guys on the street, like, what up, motherfucker? Get people just straight slanging crack rock. I can tell you, the area has been heavily gentrified. You've got a pretty diverse lot of people living around there now. There are some dodgy areas, but in general, it wasn't that gangster, quite frankly, which was a little, you know, just for the thrill and what I thought it was going to be. Didn't live up to the storyline in that sense. It's actually just a decent enough place to be. Pretty cool place, though, I think, for an event. I hope they host an event there every year. I think New York and Cologne should be the events ESL always hosts in the same location every year. Also had a very good crowd. The crowd seemed really into it. They were loving it, especially Team Liquid's run, which happened at that event just as it happened to this year's. This event was actually kind of low-key, the rise of Optic. Like, yeah, they lost to Team Liquid twice, I think. No, it can't be that. It was Fnatic that lost to Liquid. I think they did lose to Liquid overall, though. This was the rise of Optic, because this is where they beat G2, they beat Astralis. You kind of saw this is when they had Stanislaw, Nafort, Tarek, all those guys. You saw the potential they had. Only later would they kind of fulfill that. This was kind of one of the ends of, this was the last run, I think, of Astralis with Karrigan, because obviously they didn't even get out of the Swiss system. One of the first real events we used Swiss system at, but they'd made a mistake here. They did Swiss system with 8 teams, which doesn't work because they violated a bunch of stuff. Like Team Liquid and Fnatic played twice, not supposed to happen. Also, Team Liquid and Fnatic played when Fnatic, I think, had a better record than Liquid, or the other way around. Like one was 2-1 and one was 1-2. They weren't the same record. So Swiss system doesn't really work in that sense when you have 8 teams. Liquid had an insane run. They managed to make top 4. Pimp was really integrated into the lineup. Elige this was his first true event as the solo carry because Simple was gone. He played really well. I think he was the second highest rated player at the event despite only making the semis, and played a bunch of good teams. They beat Fnatic twice. Yes, the slightly dodgy Fnatic. They beat G2. They won a map versus Na'Vi Cobblestone, which that Na'Vi couldn't play. Na'Vi, this was their first 250k title. They won the title with Simple. It's their second event, I think. First 250k title ever for Guardian, one of the all-time great players. He's only won his second now at the next ESL in New York. They beat Virtus.pro in the final, who was a very tough team to beat. That was a real close final. It was a great final as well. Simple had insane stats and performance at this tournament. This coupled with the performance at Cologne, like this put him as the best player in the world for me. His level had just gone so high and he'd just become so outrageously talented. And now he was on good teams finally. Virtus.pro was very strong, absolutely could have won this tournament, but I think the final being so late and the fatigue of that epic semi-final against SK, I think really hit them hard. And also no one knew what to make of the new Na'Vi, and Simple was in full-on God mode. So I think VP was still the number 1 team in the world. SK was pretty good, but they were in this mode where they would always finish top 4, top 2, and they'd have close matches, but they'd lose them. SK versus VP semi-final, the first 2 maps of that are 2 of the best maps of Counter-Strike you will ever see. What an amazing semi. Everyone, me, Yanko, were fucking loving it. We're all into it. The crowd was into it. It was some epic shit. Third map was a bit of a letdown from what I remember, which I think it was the nuke game, right? Yeah, all in all, sick event. Yes, small field, but if you get good enough teams there, everything else about it's never going to be the biggest event because it hasn't got the massive field and the big format, but it's a pretty cool kind of side event in my opinion. I hope they keep running those. E-League Season 2. Now, I was already contracted to do Season 2 because in the first time I signed, we just signed for both seasons. So it was never discussed whether we'd swap out or not do it. So I knew I was coming back for it. The qualifiers online were a bit... I wasn't a fan of those because they allowed some big fuck-ups that I think these upsets actually just lessened the parity of the tournament because attacks in the European one beat Godsent. Kiev just going ham, and I think Kiev is still kind of a joke of a player. I don't think he's a very good player, and is a massive onliner. Echo Fox beat Team Liquid, who was obviously a good team, and because Shazam went ham, again, another fucking onliner, another team that was absolute garbage, Echo Fox, and were terrible at the tournament. They're the ones who end up being probably the biggest joke ever in the E-League, where Neo, nicest guy ever, even was like, they tried, and that was like, he tried to be nice about that, but even that's a diss on them because it was so shit. Mouse Sports won their group in kind of surprising fashion. That was the one that had Cloud9 Immortals in it. FaZe came second out of that group. First tournament with Karrigan. Only had a couple of days. Already was working his magic. Managed to beat Immortals. Managed to beat Cloud9 in best of threes. I actually think FaZe for the whole tournament could have made the final. Obviously, once they beat Virtus.pro, they were the favourite for their side of the bracket. They lost to Optic in very underwhelming fashion. This was before you had Nico, obviously. And I have to say, in this series, everyone except AZ was pure shit. The whole FaZe team was really terrible. I don't know if they underestimated Optic, if they thought it'd be easy. Who the fuck knows? But they got 2-0'd. Virtus Pro managed to lose an easy bracket. They had FaZe, then it would have been Optic or Mouse, and then they're in the final. So I really thought they were going to be in the final and play Astralis in an epic match. They fell apart. They lost to FaZe. Two, yes, very close games that FaZe won, but VP really should have won this. Even though VP was still very good at this point in time, you start to see a few niggling issues in their team, a few problems. I mean, for a start, they lost a lot of close series to not win tournaments at this point in time. Astralis finally beat NIP in the quarterfinals. Again, another big opponent for them to play. Then they beat SK, still a very good team. Snapped their streak on Train, which I think stopped at 17, was it? Or was it 18? I think it was 17. But then lost to Optic in a shocking final where, like, it's one thing that they lost the Cobblestone game. That was kind of ballsy to even pick that. But the way that they lost on Overpass was truly shocking. Like, Device was really choky on most of that map, and then obviously NAF went absolutely fucking ham to a level he's probably never done before and won that match pretty much single-handedly on that map for them. Though I still think overall Rush was the MVP for Optic over that series, over the tournament. Dignitas actually came close to beating SK. That was the one where I made that mad prediction, made a whole video on it, and actually they were up something like 13-12 or something on CT side and looked like they were going to win, but Fallen did that amazing push through Monster and got 2 key kills with an AK, and then SK came back to win the series, sadly making me go 0-7 as opposed to I would have been 1-6 like every other motherfucker in the universe was for that tournament. And obviously that would have been so epic if I'd gotten that one right. Actually, yeah, let me think. No, everyone else would have been 0-7. I would have been 1-6, but it wouldn't have been that big a difference. Predictions aren't really that big a deal. I just troll people out pretending they are. But showed the potential that Dignitas had and how well they always matched up against SK. That was like the end of the SK lineup, because after that tournament, FNX was immediately kicked due to how the rumors came out. And obviously it's kind of sad that their amazing train streak ended and then they just abandoned the team immediately. It was Optic's biggest moment. They had some huge series wins. Obviously beating Mouse wasn't that big a deal, but then they beat FaZe. Then they managed to beat Astralis, who ended up being the best team of that era. NAF went insane on the final. Like I said, I think Rush was the MVP. The schedule was pretty great for the C-League. They managed to make it so it was only 2 days a week, which I thought was a lot better. It meant that we had a lot of time to get a lot of other work done. That's why I got so much done from my apartment. It was also really cool to live in Atlanta. Uber Eats, you could get stuff till like 3 in the morning. There was lots of really great food. They'd even go like 4 miles away and bring it to you from some little restaurant. So I had a really nice time living there. It was actually quite a fun place. It didn't even start to get cold till about November. Even up to October, it was still like t-shirt weather outside. I thought all in all, it was a nice enough place. Didn't really appreciate it where after Trump got elected the next day, someone was firing a fucking pistol in the air outside my apartment, 2 in the morning. But that is just a small, fun story because nothing happened. Then the last 2 events of the year were qualifiers. I had the Americas qualifier, which I did at E-League right after E-League Season 2, so everyone was a bit wrecked on that because it was the day afterwards. It was a garbage tournament. It was basically Cloud9 Immortals. Team Liquid, even though they had, TSM rather, even though they had good players, weren't really convincing in this series. Immortals won as usual because they always used to beat Cloud9 back then. They were still a good team. I'm sad they never made it to any majors with those lineups. I thought they had some good teams. Cloud9 managed to take care of TSM and qualify, even though they were started their dip already after winning EPL. What next? Oh, the last tournament was the major qualifier, right, for the E-League Major. So I returned to Atlanta for the billionth time. Right, first of all, God sent 3-0 was a massive shock, but they didn't necessarily play all the best teams. They just kind of got a good run of form. FaZe convincingly made it through. Mouse Sports were a surprise that they qualified. They looked like they'd dropped off heavily at this point in time. They'd already lost, they were on a streak of like, they'd lost 10 maps in a row on LAN or something fucking mental. Part of it was fucking around with Nico and making him not be as much of a star player to like open up the game for Chris J and Lowell, which I didn't think was a good plan. Nico in this tournament though came back to mad form and really carried them through. Optic continued strong form, qualified easily enough. Looked like they were going to be good at the major. Obviously had a very rough draw there. Dignitas was good enough. They were still pretty solid at this point in time. Envious and G2 barely crept in. Envious especially, they only beat the shit opponents. They're a really great team for the fact that they should be reseeding in groups. Hellraisers shockingly qualified. Dead Fox had these huge games and amazingly they managed to make it. Obviously managed to beat NIP as one of the teams. They beat Mouse Spots, they beat Cloud9. So one of the toughest lineups all in all. So fair play to them for qualifying. And obviously in the first sort of 4 to 5 months of 2017, they'd established themselves as a legit team once they got over their crushing at the major. NIP lost to Vega Squadron famously on Cash, where like Forrest and Get Right combined for fucking 10 kills or some joke shit like that. That team already should have made a roster move at that point in time, but they were stubborn, so they didn't. Immortals sadly lost the last game to G2. Like, we needed one of those teams to make it. They both, I think, were good enough to make it and should have if they've been reseeding. Scream had that insane headshot to get them through. This tournament was a fucking brutal schedule. I actually, at this tournament, I started to hate the Swiss system, because the Swiss system means every day is 8 best of ones, so it can be 8 to 10 or 12 hours, depending on how delayed they get. And the last day is always 9 best of ones. That is too many games for talent where we were in the setup where we did every game. It was way too many games, and I think it really takes its toll on, like, not only your life, like that might take years off your life being wrecked like that, but also it really reduces the quality of what you can do with casting. When you're on like 30% level, you can't get your best analysis and the best jokes and the best entertainment out of people. You've got to have breaks. And that's one thing I think E-League did a bad job with, is only having us and not having proper rotation. It's one thing for the season where we work 2 days a week. You can't have people doing like 5 days with like 8 games a day and then 9 games on the last day. That was too much for us overall. So all in all, 2016, very different year because I had the long E-League seasons. Obviously that made up like a decent amount of my income. The amount of money you could make from casting went up a lot this year, so it finally became more than just a side thing that I did. Before that, journalism and sponsorship was always what made me most of my money. Now E-League was, and all the other tournaments, rates were going way up, so it was starting to get very legit. And because we were starting to see other tournaments become 4 to 6 day events, that also pushed the rates up. So for 2017, it's been great in that sense. I've had to work hardly any events in comparison, but already you make a lot more money and it's a lot better environment in that sense. We've improved a lot of environment components. Also, I've always said this, just because it annoys me and to take the hit for other people, I'll always complain about any problems at events, and it does get things done. The old saying, you know, the greasy wheel, the squeaky wheel's the one that gets the grease. That's true, and as a result, things have changed over time. We get energy drinks, we get better days, we get breaks, we get people rotating stuff, we get better call times, we get more of a say in what we do in the games. These have all happened over, and this year was a big step progression forwards overall for that. And also, as a side topic, it was the year where by the end of the year, for me, it was clear that Sadicus and Energy were the #1 casting duo. Anders and Samuel were still very good, they're still elite, but the others had overtaken them, they'd grinded for it, ground out their kind of success, they'd really paid their dues, and it was time for them to become #1, and I'm glad they did the next year.
Machine here, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel. 20-minute video for 2 minutes worth of content. Gold.